Hello and welcome to the Alex Nitzberg Show. I'm Alex Nitzberg and today my guest is Robert Spencer. Robert is the director of Jihad Watch, a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He's written 16 books, including his most recent, The Complete Infidel's Guide to Iran. He's a weekly columnist for PJ Media and Front Page Magazine, and he's written hundreds of articles about jihad and Islamic terrorism. Robert has led seminars on Islam and jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, United States Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, and the U.S. intelligence community, and that's just a portion of his extensive resume. So I want to thank you for joining me on the show today, Robert. It's great to have you on.
Great to be here. Thanks, Alex.
So I want to start out with this, a couple of things about you. It says on Jihad Watch that you've been banned by the British government from entering the United Kingdom. Is this ban still in effect, and why was it instituted, and when will it expire?
I don't think it'll ever expire, although if the May government is ever voted out of office and a government that's more realistic about the jihad threat comes in, I will certainly try to get it reversed. But yes, it's still in place, and I think it will always be in place as long as the political establishment in Britain is in place. The letter from the UK Home Office that came to me said that I was being banned for saying that Islam has a doctrine of warfare against unbelievers. And since Islam does have a doctrine of warfare against unbelievers, that's like banning me for saying that water is wet. And so it doesn't trouble me too much. The real problem that should trouble people in Britain is that at the same time that they banned me, they let in a jihad preacher who said that jihad was the smashing of skulls and the spilling of the blood of infidels. That didn't seem to bother them, and they've let in numerous jihad preachers since then. So clearly the British government was trying to appease its increasingly restive and aggressive Muslim population and not reacting to some genuine so-called extremism on my part.
Wow, so I read online that it was a 3 to 5 year ban, but you don't think that even after the 5 years are up that they'll let you back in?
No, this has become something that is sort of a symbol for the Theresa May government. Just a few months ago, she was boasting in a speech that she had banned me and a few others, along with people like Abu Hamza and Abu Qatada, who are jihad terrorists. And so she was equating people who oppose jihad terror and speak honestly about its ideological roots to people who actually commit acts of jihad terror or plot to. And so she is engaging in that kind of moral equivalence. It's inconceivable that she would turn around and let me into the country. However, her approach to the terror threat is so drastically fantasy-based and unrealistic that I think that it's likely to result in her being voted out of office in the near future as it becomes increasingly clear just how threatened Britain is by jihad terror, and that a more realistic government could come in, and then I will try again to get into the country.
Now, Regenry Publishing includes in your biography that you live in a secure, undisclosed location. Is that true? Do you attempt to keep your home address secret, and is that because you or your family have been threatened before?
Yes, I do, and I have been threatened many times, and that's why I don't let my whereabouts be known as much as I can control that. And this is just something that comes with the territory. It's unfortunately the case that pretty much anybody who has spoken out about these issues in a realistic manner and has dared to identify the motivating ideology behind jihad terrorism is threatened in this way.
Wow. So what are some of the most important issues that Americans might not already understand about Islam and the threat that it poses to America and the rest of the world?
Well, the prevailing view is, of course, that Islam is a religion of peace, and it's been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists, and every religion has its extremists, and so this is just something that happens. It's unfortunate, and we cannot apply any particular scrutiny to Islam or Muslims as a result. And I reject that prevailing view and contend that jihadis are working demonstrably from texts and teachings of Islam, and that we have to understand that in order to formulate a proper response to the threat that they pose, in order to understand them fully, because you can't defeat an enemy you don't understand. And it is not racism or bigotry or hatred to note that jihadis are using the texts and teachings of Islam to justify violence and hatred and supremacism. And it's not indicting all Muslims. If Muslims are not doing that, then great, more power to them. But those who are, we need to deal with realistically.
And in your recent article on PJ Media titled "How Islamophobia Endangers Us All," you explained that the term Islamophobia advances political correctness and discourages people from speaking up, and you referred to the term as, quote, a propaganda neologism with no fixed meaning. So could you just explain the point you were making in your article and why you use the term propaganda to describe the term Islamophobia?
Well, it was actually a term that was chosen by propagandists in order to intimidate people into being afraid to oppose jihad terror. This happened in the offices of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is a group tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, and this was back in the 90s. There was somebody there who later left the movement, a man named Abdurrahman Muhammad, and he wrote about this and revealed what had happened and explained that Islamophobia was devised, the term was chosen to make people think that it was equivalent to racism or bigotry to speak about the motivating ideology of jihad terrorists. And that being the case, many people are afraid to speak out and afraid to act against jihad terror because they're afraid of charges of Islamophobia and racism and hatred. One notorious example of this came just a couple of years ago in San Bernardino, where there were two jihadis who killed 15 people at a Christmas party on December 2nd, 2015. And those people, their neighbors noted that after the fact, that they had been behaving very suspiciously, and there were all sorts of strange and suspicious comings and goings at their house all through the night. But they did not go to police because they didn't want to appear to be racially profiling or Islamophobic. And so that's how Islamophobia actually kills people, and not how we are always told that it does, that is, that innocent Muslims are being killed. If that were happening, that would be inexcusable, but it isn't actually happening. And what is really happening is that people are afraid to fight against jihad terror because of charges of Islamophobia, and so people get killed in attacks that could have and should have been prevented if people had not been intimidated into thinking it wrong to act.
So, besides attacks in America, we consistently hear about attacks elsewhere, specifically in Europe, and yesterday a terrorist shot 3 French police officers, and there's also been the horrific stories about rapes perpetrated by Muslim men in Europe. So, what does the United States government need to do to stop America from becoming more like Europe?
In the first place, Alex, the Trump bans on immigration from jihadi hotspots need to be implemented, and there need to be more to follow it. And they have been blocked by leftist activist judges who have been ignoring the fact that the president has the right and responsibility under American law to enact such bans. Now that there is a full-strength Supreme Court, those decisions need to be examined by the highest court, which I am confident will affirm that the president was entirely within his rights to enact these bans and to make sure that he can do so in the future. If that is not done, then more jihad terrorists are going to come in the refugee stream. There is no reliable way to vet the refugees in order to keep out jihadis and bring in harmless people. So we have a choice. We either can inconvenience some harmless people and bar them from coming in, or we allow in some jihad terrorists who are going to kill Americans. The left, the Democratic Party, is determined that we have to allow Americans to get killed in jihad attacks by jihadi refugees, or else we're racist and bigoted and Islamophobic. And the president was saying that we have to, on the other hand, try to protect Americans, and that will unfortunately mean that some people will not be able to come in who were deserving. It's either or. There is no other third choice. People who say, well, we'll simply vet them more properly, that cannot be done because of Islam's doctrines of deception and because the Islamic State very carefully trains its people to be able to evade any kind of scrutiny by law enforcement. They know what they know what they'll be asked, they know what law enforcement will be looking for, and so they're able to counteract it.
Well, that's kind of similar to one of my other questions, which was on your website, on Jihad Watch, it says, quote, not all self-proclaimed moderates are truly moderate. And so I want to know, and I think maybe you've kind of answered this, but how can you tell whether someone is radical or moderate, especially if some of them might be lying when they're saying that they're moderate? And how many moderate Muslims do you think there are in America versus radical Muslims that want to destroy America?
Well, Alex, this is a big problem of definition. People speak of moderate Muslims and they assume that that means people who are Muslim but who reject jihad terrorism. And that's a reasonable definition. But does that include, say, the Council on American Islamic Relations? The Council on American Islamic Relations is the most influential and powerful Islamic advocacy group in the United States today. And they certainly condemn jihad terrorism. They condemn attacks on Americans when they happen. And yet, at the same time, they have opposed claiming them as racist and bigoted. They've opposed pretty much every counterterror measure that's ever been proposed or implemented since 9/11. And they counsel Muslims not to cooperate with the FBI. And so, what side are they really on? They say that they're against all this, and yet the policies that they advocate for would only enable jihad terrorists to act more effectively without opposition from law enforcement. And so, is that a moderate or not? And the question is, how many Muslims really do oppose the ultimate goal of terrorism, which is to impose Islamic law over the world? And that is a much smaller number than those who are actively taking up arms and throwing bombs and so on. And so we need to define the term carefully in the first place, and then we can answer it. And really the ultimate question of how many Muslims actually would prefer to live in a secular society where there's no established religion and everybody is equal with rights before the law, that's a very small group, because Islamic law, which is considered to be the law of Allah, the perfect law, counsels that Muslims should have special rights and privileges above and beyond those of others, and that there's no freedom of speech, no democracy as we know it, and so on. And so there are Muslims who will say that they are perfectly happy and loyal Americans, and no doubt there are many who are. But a knowledgeable and informed Muslim who is ready to defend Islam and ready to implement Islam in every way will consider that the constitutional government without its established religion and so on of the United States is something that has to be swept aside. And so this might be done violently, but it might not be done violently. And so when you were talking about the actual number of Muslims who are committed to democratic principles, committed to secular government, and so on, that's very small in any genuine way.
All right. And so when we're looking at Europe, do you think that it's possible that Europe could fall to Islam in the next 30 to 50 years if it continues going the way it has been recently?
Sure. After all, you're talking about a belief system that has a political component and that touts that political component as superior to any other political system. And so here again, not all Muslims believe that, but those who do are going to be acting, and nothing is being done to stop them. Instead, the British government and the European governments are pursuing policies of appeasement and accommodation that ultimately are going to give away the whole store, the whole country, unless they stop and say, well, here we have to stop and not appease and accommodate you, but stand up for our own principles. But there's no sign of any European government or the British government doing that in any significant way so far. There have been bans on the headscarf in France, and those created such an outcry. It was astonishing that even to ban the headscarf or to ban minarets in Switzerland was considered to be some horrible violation of human rights. And so imagine what would happen if the governments of Europe were to try to move against the elements of political Islam. It would be impossible for them to do so in today's political climate. If this doesn't change and change quickly, then they're done for.
And I also wanted to talk to you about the media. On Jihad Watch, you aggregate and provide commentary on a large number of terrorism-related news stories. And so as you observe the national and international media landscape, what is your analysis of the media's reporting on issues related to Islam and terrorism?
Well, it's abysmal. Most of the time, it's frankly apologetic. The media seems to consider one of its responsibilities to be, after every terror attack, to make sure that people don't think ill of Islam or Muslims, and not to report on the attack accurately. They search for all sorts of alternative explanations for terror attacks and try to exonerate Islam from any responsibility for the crimes done in its name and in accord with its teachings. And so they are, in other words, actively engaging in misleading the American people and keeping them ignorant and complacent about a genuine threat. And so their role is positively counterproductive.
And, on Jihad Watch, there's a section called Why Jihad Watch. And after explaining what dhimmis are, like that they're non-Muslims living under oppression of Muslim rule, the site says, quote, spearheaded by dhimmi academics and self-serving advocacy groups, that same attitude of chastened subservience has entered into Western academic study of Islam, and from there into journalism, school textbooks, and popular discourse. One must not point out the depredations of jihad and dhimmitude. To do so would offend the multiculturalist ethos that prevails everywhere today. To do so would endanger chances for peace and rapprochement between civilizations all too ready to clash. So, can you just explain what this means and explain what the term dhimmi means and what you're meaning when you refer to dhimmi academics and dhimmi journalists?
Sure. The historical sense is the dhimmis are protected people. That's what the word means. And they are protected by the Muslims because they submit to the hegemony of the Muslims. The Quran says that Muslims must fight against the people of the book, which is the Quranic term for Jews and Christians primarily, until the people of the book pay the jizya, which is a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. That's chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. And so the dhimmis, the protected people, they pay this tax and they submit to the Muslim rule, and they submit to various humiliating and discriminatory regulations which deny them basic rights and ensure that they are feeling themselves subdued as the Quran commands. Now, the sense that I was using it for academics and others is that there are non-Muslims in the West, particularly academics and intellectuals, who adopts the same sort of attitude of subservience and submission to Islam and never question the human rights record of Islamic countries. Feminists are very concerned about the rights of women in the United States, but never say a thing, and indeed sometimes make excuses for the abysmal situation of women in countries that enforce Islamic law. That is a kind of dhimmitude of its own, a kind of submission and subservience to the Islamic agenda. And so I think that it is a direct analogy to the legal status of non-Muslims in Islamic law.
So you're using the term because you're saying that they're willingly submitting themselves by not exposing what's happening in other countries under Islamic rule.
Yes, by indeed actively abetting it in some ways. I mean, look, for example, at the Women's March on Washington on January 21st, right after President Trump was inaugurated, the feminists all over the country come to Washington, and they march all over the country as well against Trump and his supposed misogyny. Now, that's all very well, and I'm certainly not interested in making excuses for statements that he made or anything of that kind. But one of the leaders of the Women's March in Washington was Linda Sarsour, who is openly in favor of Sharia, of Islamic law. Now, Sharia, Islamic law, allows for a man to beat his wife if he fears disobedience from her, and allows a man to have 4 wives if he wishes, and also sex slaves who are captured infidel women. It allows for a woman to have a lesser inheritance rights and lesser value of testimony from a man. I mean, it calls for that. A woman's testimony is worth half that of a man, And on inheritance, a woman will receive a smaller share than that received by her brothers. And so it actively discriminates against women. It actively shows women as inferior. And yet this person who is in favor of it explicitly is one of the leaders of the feminist march. And so you got to wonder, well, how committed are these feminists to feminism? They're only committed to it when it comes to non-Muslims, but when it comes to Islam, then their feminist principles are out the window, and suddenly they're accepting a level of misogyny that they would never accept in any other context.
And you've spoken at a lot of colleges also. And so I wanted to ask you, overall, what's your experience been when you're speaking at colleges?
Generally, I assume that any college is going to be a hostile environment with a lot of self-righteous and very poorly informed students trying to shout me down. Sometimes I'm physically menaced, and sometimes I don't get to speak at all because of being shouted down. Sometimes they allow me to speak, and then I'm subjected to a great deal of hostile questioning. I don't mind hostile questioning at all, and I'm always ready to go into the fray and to defend my positions. But I think it's just sort of indicative of how colleges today have become centers of leftist indoctrination and propaganda, and are in no sense anywhere in the country, with maybe a couple of exceptions here and there, but in no sense are they institutions of actual higher learning where people engage with and deal with alternative points of view. These college students today are not taught to engage with points of view that are unpopular or unwelcome, but rather to treat them with violence or to shout them down. This is a kind of institutionalized thuggery that reminds me of the early days of Nazi Germany, when brown shirts would go to college campuses, and where there were anti-Nazi professors, they would shout them down and brutalize them. And nowadays, it's the left doing the same thing. They're reviving that same kind of fascism in the name of anti-fascism.
It sounded like you used the term physical menacing. What have you experienced specifically while you've been on college campuses?
Well, like for example, last week or a couple weeks ago, I spoke at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. And before I went there, there were people on Twitter saying that I should be punched or bash the fash, that is, hit the fascist. I'm supposedly a fascist for standing for the freedom of speech and the equality of rights of all people before the law. And they're, of course, anti-fascists by wanting to have me violently attacked for doing so. And so, I went with a security team, and there were a lot of police around, and so I was not attacked when I was there. But this is the kind of environment that the left has created on campuses today. Obviously, the most notorious example is at the University of California at Berkeley, which is such a center now of fascism and violence that really it should just be shut down. And routinely, if any speaker that is not on the hard left comes to campus, then there are riots, and they have to be spirited out before they themselves are attacked. We saw that with Milo. David Horowitz's speech was just canceled last week or a couple weeks ago for the same reason, and now there's a controversy as we do this interview with Ann Coulter refusing the cancellation and saying she's going to show up anyway. And kudos to her for that, and we'll see how that shakes out. But there will certainly be violent thugs who are there to try to shut her down and attack her physically if they can, and doing so convinced of their own righteousness as opponents of fascism.
A few months ago, I was listening to one of your presentations, and you said something really interesting. You were telling a story about a girl at one college who said hate speech is not free speech when you'd ask her what her conclusion was after reading your book. I think that's kind of a shocking statement, and I wanted to know, since you've been to a lot of colleges, do you meet students with this point of view very often, or is that kind of a one-off situation?
That was the first I'd heard of it, but that's an increasingly common statement that I've heard many times since then. And I think that many college students today actually think that there is some sort of a provision in the Constitution or U.S. law that says that hate speech does not have free speech protection. And they, just like that girl that you mentioned who was at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California, there are many, many students today who think that there is some sort of objectively identifiable category called hate speech that does not have First Amendment protection. And they don't realize that their leftist worldview is just a leftist worldview and is not objective fact. And so they think that to object to it or to deviate from it is hate speech and ought to be shut down. This is the very definition of authoritarianism and tyranny. And I fear for the future of the United States when these little thugs are full grown and are in charge of our institutions. Unless there is some serious pushback, then they will certainly destroy what remains of free speech protection and impose some sort of authoritarian leftist regime that would criminalize any dissent from the leftist line. And clearly, there are many, many college students who would love to do just that right now.
And you've got a book coming out in a few months this summer called The Complete Infidel's Guide to Free Speech and Its Enemies. So I wanted to ask you, what topics are you covering in that book?
That is an account of the Islamic war on the freedom of speech that has been going on for well over a decade now. The leftist war on the freedom of speech has been remarked by many people, but the Islamic war on the freedom of speech has been, I think, less noted. And so the Complete Infidel's Guide to Free Speech and Its Enemies deals with that and how the leftists in the United States are actually working hand in glove with international Islamic groups to try to circumvent and render null and void the First Amendment and to do exactly what we've been talking about, criminalize any opposition to their line, criminalize any dissent from the left's agenda and the Islamic agenda that have allied and go hand in hand at this point.
Okay, and my last question is, people say Islam is a religion of peace, and a lot of, liberal people object to what you're saying. So do you think that Islam rightly interpreted leads to jihad? Or when you're teaching people about the dangers of Islam, why do we have these people that are continually arguing with you and saying it's peaceful, and then we have people saying it's dangerous, and obviously people are killing people, and they're using Islam as the reason for why they're doing it? So do you think, is there two streams going on, or is it just that there are liberal people not taking it literally, the people that take it literally end up attacking? What's going on there?
Well, certainly there are a lot of Muslims who don't wage jihad, just like there are a lot of Christians who don't love their enemies and turn the other cheek. There are many Muslims who don't pay attention to the jihad exhortations in the Quran and Islamic tradition and law, but it doesn't mean they're not there. And they are there. And so when I say that it's not a religion of peace, I'm speaking about the teachings, not the way any individual Muslim who may have a variety of influences and priorities puts those teachings into practice. And so that's the one thing, that people don't make a distinction between Islam and Muslims. They know Muslims who are nice people, and so they think Islam must be a religion of peace. Anybody who has read the Quran, and more importantly, anybody who's read the Quran and understands and has also read how it is interpreted by mainstream Islamic authorities, nobody in that position could believe that Islam is a religion of peace. And this is the difficulty that I encounter, that people say that Islam is a religion of peace without actually having read the text. And they think the texts aren't really important because people interpret them in different ways, and they've never made any effort to look into the interpretative tradition within Islam and to see that, yes, mainstream interpretation also holds that Muslims must wage war against and subjugate unbelievers. And so it's not a religion of peace by any stretch of the imagination. But we're dealing with a lot of willful ignorance around because of the protected victim status that Muslim advocacy groups have so carefully and successfully cultivated in the West today. And so leftists think Muslims are being victimized by right-wing Islamophobes. We have to stand with them. And if they say that it's not a religion of peace, then we must say the opposite.
So is it your contention then that the people that are arguing against what you're saying, the people that are saying it's really peaceful, they're either ignorant of what they're talking about, or they are ignoring, if there's a nominal Muslim who's just ignoring the text, maybe they know what it says, but they don't want to do it. So it's one of those two things?
Yeah, and people often say, you're saying that if I'm not a terrorist, I'm a bad Muslim. No, that's not what I'm saying, because you can perfectly well be a peaceful Muslim and be very devout and not be acting upon the jihad verses, because jihad is a collective obligation on the Islamic community. And if some people are discharging that obligation, then others don't have to. And so the idea that any good Muslim will be a terrorist, this is not anything I've actually really said. But I am saying, and I stand by, that Islamic teaching in the Quran, in the traditions of Muhammad, and in Islamic law all mandate warfare against unbelievers. And any informed Muslim who is honest will acknowledge that.
So if they really understand and they're willing to believe it, then they might not necessarily have to do it themselves, you're saying, in order to obey the teachings of Islam, but they would have to support others who are doing it, in theory.
Well, they just know that they're not doing anything wrong.
So they might not actually be involved in it themselves, but intellectually they're not going to be like, I think this is bad, you should stop doing it. They're going to think, you're doing the right thing when you're committing terrorism.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's why we see surveys all around the world that show alarmingly high support for things like suicide bombing and things like that, because Muslims know in general what's in the teachings of the Quran and so on.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining me on the show today, Robert. It's been great having you on.
Thanks. My pleasure, Alex. Much appreciated.
And if you'd like to learn more about Robert Spencer and his work, you can visit jihadwatch.org. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the Alex Nitzberg Show. Please follow me on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/Alex Nitzberg, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode of the Alex Nitzberg Show.